Get situated here. So, the first thing I want to say is it is a very real pleasure for me to be back here at MGIMO. I had a very unusual privilege and honor when I worked at the United States Embassy in Moscow for 4 years between 1998 and 2002. And that was the opportunity to teach 2 courses here at MGIMO. And it was really one of the highlights, if not the highlight, of the 4 years that I spent as a U.S. diplomat at our embassy in downtown Moscow. The opportunity to come here to this extraordinary institution and to interact over the course of 2 semesters with 75 really talented, capable students, many of whom have gone on to do great things. To me, that was an extraordinary opportunity. And so I want to say thank you very much to Chairwoman Alexeyeva for the kind invitation to be here. I want to thank Vice Rector Andrei Solantyev, who is a good friend and who was my boss when I was teaching here 14 years ago already, for that opportunity, and also to Vladimir for the great work that he does here. But above all, to all of you for coming and making the time to spend some time together on a cloudy Thursday afternoon here in Moscow. I have not been back to MGIMO since 2002. So I feel very much at home here. I still recognize the hallways. Some things are new. But this is a special treat for me, and I want you to know that. So what I want to talk about today is a topic that I think pretty much any student at MGIMO would find of some interest. This is a great university under the Foreign Ministry that does a superb job teaching and training future international affairs professionals, future diplomats, and so on. And the topic that I want to address, I think, is very, very salient to students who are studying that kind of topic matter. And it's the question of why do major international conflicts occur in the world today? Why do conflicts happen? Now that sounds like a very big and substantial topic to try to get into. And in fact it is. But I've done a lot of thinking about this over the years, and in the last year or so that thinking has crystallized. And so I want to share basically a theory that I call the theory of the X factor. That is EX, the X factor. And that is the role of exceptionalism in major international conflict in the 21st century. But it's even broader than that. It's actually a theory about why conflict happens, and exceptionalism is one key ingredient, and there are others that I'll share as well. So today, what I'd like to do is to take about roughly 50 minutes, 50, and share with you some of my ideas, specifically around the topic of, number one, past or earlier theories of conflict. I want to make a few brief comments about that, about some of the work that's already been done and how my work and my theory builds on that work. Number two, the common elements of major international conflict. Because I think when you want to study international conflict, you have to look around and say, what do all conflicts have in common? And so I'll talk about that. Then I want to talk specifically about exceptionalism, and specifically the definition of exceptionalism, the types of exceptionalism, and why it is that I regard exceptionalism as essentially being what I call the active ingredient in major international conflict. After that, I'll make a brief reference to a few cases of real conflicts in the world and potential conflicts in the world, and talk a little bit about the degree to which my ideas match up with real-world cases. And finally, I'll share a few thoughts on the implications of my theory for policymakers and for scholars and students, and then I'll offer a few concluding thoughts. I hope that'll take us till about 5 o'clock, and then I hope that we'll have at least 20 or 25 minutes to get questions from you. I remember that when I was teaching here 14 years ago, my favorite part of the class was the part of the class when I stopped speaking and started listening to you, to your predecessors who were students here at that time. They often had great questions, great comments. Sometimes they challenged my point of view. By the way, my courses were on political consulting and the American political campaign, which is a topic that is very salient today. And if anyone has questions about what's happening in the U.S. presidential race or about Donald Trump, I can share some of my ideas with you about that. But I do look forward to hearing from you. And this is the first time that I've done this talk for a Russian audience. In fact, it's the first time I've done this talk for a primarily foreign audience, non-American audience. So quite genuinely, the opportunity to get your feedback on my ideas is very meaningful to me, and I hope that you'll not be shy when you share your thoughts. By the way, let me also note before I start in earnest that the last time I slept was about 26 hours ago. I just arrived today from Washington, D.C. through Frankfurt. So I'm going to do my best to stay energized, to stay awake. And if you see me nodding off sometime while I'm speaking, please shout out or get my attention so that I'll stay awake. But actually, the excitement of being here, I think, is what's going to keep me going. So let me start by just saying a few things about earlier theories of conflict. And I won't go into great detail, except to say that, needless to say, I'm not the first person ever to try to create a theory for why conflict happens in the world, or a theory related to the broad issue of conflict in the world. So I want to just mention 3 theories that have been, at one point, respectively, pretty well regarded, but that all have seemed to fall short in explaining what's happening in the world today. So let me start first with Francis Fukuyama. How many of you, by a show of hands, are familiar with Francis Fukuyama and his work? He wrote a very well-known, in the United States, the West, and I think in Russia as well, a very well-known paper, later a book, called The End of History. And the book was called The End of History and the Last Man. And his basic idea was that when the Cold War ended in 1989, but certainly by 1991, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, during that period, his idea was that with the end of the Cold War, basically the struggle for the future direction of mankind was over. That everybody basically agreed, in his argument, that democracy is the way to govern and that the market is the way to create prosperity economically. And that there really wasn't any further debate about which system was best because, as he wrote, the results were already very clearly evident. Therefore, the notion that there would be major scale conflict around ideological issues had kind of disappeared. And so in a sense, with the end of history, we were ultimately looking at the end of conflict. Now, I don't think I have to spend a lot of time suggesting to you that conflict is not yet over in the world, and that perhaps, for better or worse, depending on one's perspective, history is not yet over either. And one could cite any number of examples, but I think all I would cite is everything that's happening in the world today, and many things that have happened since 1991 that suggest that indeed we've got quite a bit more history to live through, and unfortunately, quite a bit more conflict as a human race to deal with. So here was an idea that at one point seemed bold, then it seemed to make a lot of sense, and then after a while it seemed to not have a very high level of explanatory value. So along came another American scholar named Samuel Huntington. If you've heard of Samuel Huntington, could you raise your hands? Pretty well-known Americans, I think most of you have heard of him, probably studied or read at least one of his articles entitled The Clash of Civilizations. And so Samuel Huntington argued, okay, and he wrote in 1993, he said, okay, Francis Fukuyama didn't quite get it right. History's not over, conflict continues, so let me, Samuel Huntington, try to explain what's going on. And he postulated that there were and are in the world approximately 8 geo-civilizational blocks. Basically 8 regions in the world. North America, South America, Europe, I think Russia may have been in its own category, China, East Asia, Africa, and so on, and the Islamic world, etc. And Mr. Huntington's basic point of view was that the clashes we would see in the world going forward would be between these civilizational blocks. So that was a new theory about conflict. And at first it seemed bold, and then it seemed to make a lot of sense. But what we've seen subsequent to the publication of that article is that, in fact, there are a lot of examples where that theory doesn't seem to be explaining what's happening in the world. For one thing, between most of those civilizational blocks, there aren't conflicts. So if the idea was that civilizational blocks are the forces behind conflict, and that the conflict in the world would occur on the fault lines or the meeting points of those civilizations, then we ought to be seeing conflict between South America and Africa, Africa and the United States and Eastern Europe, or Russia, Russia and China, China and Islamic world. But the fact is, in none of those cases do we see major scale conflict. And secondly, something that Huntington, I think, didn't fully anticipate is the idea that within civilizations, as he defined them, within geo-civilizational blocks, you're actually seeing conflict occurring inside the blocks, not external to the blocks. One very salient example today is the Islamic world, which is not unitary. There is Shiite Muslims, there are Sunni Muslims, and in many cases they're killing each other. And according to Huntington, that shouldn't be happening. So I think it's clear that Huntington's theory doesn't make a lot of sense today either. It seemed to make sense at the time, but it doesn't explain what's happening in the world today. And the third theory that I would mention is probably one that you haven't heard of, because it was not as widely known, but I thought it was quite thoughtful. And it was by a guy, another American, named Thomas Barnett. And he was a civilian professor who was teaching in the U.S. military system. So he was not a soldier, but he was a professor who was teaching soldiers. And he wrote a book called The Pentagon's New Map. And the idea was that if you look at the world and see it as a map, that the map has basically 2 distinct areas. One area is the connected world, and the other area is the disconnected world. And his view, and he was writing approximately in 2006, 2007, his view was that the fundamental conflict in the world was going to occur between the disconnected world on the one hand and the connected world on the other, or wholly within the disconnected world. What did he mean by connected and unconnected or disconnected? He meant connected to trade, connected to labor force movements, connected to migration, connected to the internet, connected to flows of investment, connected to technology, connected to information, and basically connected to the process of globalization. That's what he was referring to. Whereas the disconnected were not connected to any of those things. They were not part of, quote, McWorld. They were not part of the international economy. They're not connected to the internet and so on. And this idea seemed to make quite a bit of sense because, as he did in his book, if you looked at a map of the world and looked at the parts of the world that were least connected to the rest of the world in the ways that I've described, ways that he described, that tended to be where the problems were. But then two things happened. Number one, it turns out that folks who weren't connected in 2006, in many cases, are connected now, but are still problems. Let me give you one example. ISIS. ISIS is not disconnected from the information world, at least. In fact, on the contrary, they put out more YouTube videos, grotesque and horrific videos, than many other countries and organizations put out themselves. So they're now plugged into connectivity, at least in an information sense. They use it for their recruiting. They use it to show the macabre and horrific brutality that they perpetrate, but they're not disconnected. That's not something that I think Professor Barnett would have anticipated. But perhaps more fundamentally, the problem with that argument is a second point. And that is that we see a lot of conflict within the connected world. And according to his theory, that shouldn't be happening. I can give you a few examples. But frankly, the tensions between Russia and Ukraine, however one might wish to describe them, would fall into that category because Russia is a very connected country. Ukraine is in many ways a connected country. It's part of the world. And yet there are very high levels of tensions, obviously, and frankly there's been very substantial loss of life as a result of those tensions. Same thing with China, dealing with Japan, dealing with Southeast Asia over the South China Sea issue. China's very connected to the world. It's the number 2 economy in the world. By some measures, it's the number 1 economy in the world. And yet, it's in dealing with Japan and dealing with Vietnam, the Philippines, or others, or for that matter, Taiwan. Those are conflicts or tensions that are occurring within the connected world, and that's not fully explained by Thomas Barnett. So the point that I would make is others have tried to put forward these theories. And I'm cognizant that Professor Alexeyeva chairs the political science department, and so I wanted to bring some theoretical material to the talk out of respect for the professor. And so those are some kind of backdrop points to make as I talk about what my ideas are. So with that being said, I think it's clear that there is not at present a unifying theory that really speaks to why conflict occurs today in the real world. None of these theories that I've mentioned, all of which seemed thoughtful and were popular at the time they were produced, seem to apply anymore. So with that, let me now shift to kind of the meat of the topic and talk about the key elements of understanding major international conflict, the key elements of major international conflict. And here, let me just say a word about my methodology. So how did I do what I did to try to understand this issue and to try to generate this theory? Well, what I did was pretty simple. Recognizing that we live in a pretty tumultuous period in the world where there is a lot of conflict across the globe, I looked around and I asked this question: where are the conflicts, and what do these conflicts or potential conflicts have in common? And I tried to actually analyze the commonalities of the conflicts. Now let me make one other point before I share those commonalities with you. One thing that I was not looking at as I did this research, and it wasn't a very, I have to say, it wasn't, or is not yet, let's say, a very deep, intensive research effort, but it was more of a thought process, which really crystallized for reasons that I'll mention in a minute, over the last several months. But as I was doing this, I was not looking at the issue of domestic conflict. So conflict that is contained within the borders of a nation, that's not something I'm looking at or trying to explain. Civil war, civil unrest, terrorist problems or terrorist attacks within a country that the country is dealing with within its own borders. Those are not the things that I was trying to explain. The thing that I am trying to explain is why international conflict, and specifically major international conflict, occurs. So that's the universe of issues that I'm working on. Now, I want to make one point before I delve into the rest of this, and that is just to back up one step and say, why did I even get into this topic of exceptionalism and international conflict? About a year and a half ago, I was giving a speech on U.S.-Iran relations at a university called Michigan State University in the United States, a big school, very well regarded, and I was invited to do a talk on Iran. And in the course of the talk, I made the point when someone asked me, David, how is it that you are working on Russia and China and Iran all at the same time? Sometimes I ask myself that question. Not an easy set of countries to work on. But I was explaining that the thing that ties these countries together is that in all cases, in their relationships with the United States, there is a very substantial lack of strategic trust. It's true with Russia and the United States, unfortunately. It's true with China and the United States, and it's certainly true with Iran and the United States. But then I made another point that I hadn't even thought about before I said it. It just came to me spontaneously. And that was the other thing that really makes these three relationships in particular, U.S.-Russia, U.S.-China, U.S.-Iran, quite similar in some respects, is that they are relationships between countries in which both countries regard themselves as exceptional. And I hadn't thought of it before I said it, but it kind of came out. And I realized, frankly, I was onto something. A lot of people talk about the United States as an exceptional nation. Certainly we in the United States talk about that. A lot of others outside the United States comment about the U.S. sense of exceptionalism, sometimes approvingly, sometimes disapprovingly. In fact, even President Putin wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal referencing U.S. exceptionalism a year plus ago. And yet very few people relatively talk about the exceptionalism of other nations. And that's what got me thinking about exceptionalism, because what I realized is that it's not just the United States. It's a bunch of other countries as well, and I'll share those with you. So that's how I got into this topic. Now let me share with you what I found to be several commonalities in major international conflict or potential major international conflict today. So the first one is that all major international conflicts or potential conflicts today, first point, have at least one state involved. Now, that may sound obvious, but let's remember that there are many non-state actors. For example, ISIS. There are others as well. But I would say when I say ISIS, I also mean radical Islamic terrorism, radical Islam, radical Islamism, whatever term one wants to use. Those folks that perversely use the Islamic faith as a basis for committing terrorist acts. And they're not a state, but they're an active player in the world, unfortunately, and brutally. And so you can have non-state actors in a conflict, but you cannot have a conflict merely, a major international conflict, merely between non-state actors. There's got to be a state involved, and the reason is, in my theory, this is my theory, so I may be right, I may be wrong, but in my judgment, the reason is that you need a state in order to generate the resources and apply the resources necessary to make a conflict major. And I would argue that today we don't see a major international conflict between non-state actors. There always is at least one state involved. So that's number one. The second thing that kind of flows from that is that in all major conflicts today, there is at least one player involved, whether it is the state or whether it is a non-state actor, that is not a democracy. That is to say, the term I like to use is that it is a state or non-state entity in which there is no direct electoral accountability. The leaders are not directly elected or accountable to the people through elections. Now, when I say that it's a non-democracy, the state or the non-state actor, I'm not saying that with any sense of moral judgment for purposes of this theory. What I'm saying is that if you look at the conflicts and potential conflicts today, you will not find one that involves two democracies. So that's the second point. The third point is a little bit more nuanced, and it goes to the issue of the relative power balance between the parties to the conflict. And I'm still thinking about this, but let me share it for now anyway. And that is the idea that conflict tends to occur within a certain bandwidth or range or spectrum of power differential. And what I mean by that is, usually the parties to the conflict are roughly comparable in the scale of their force, but not exactly comparable. At the same time, you typically don't see a case in which one player beats up, and I'm talking about today because there are historical exceptions, where one massively big player beats up on a tiny player. And I call this the US and Fiji example. You'll never see the United States go to war with Fiji. The reason is we would never have to go to war to get anything that we ever wanted from Fiji. It would not be necessary because the imbalance of power is so substantial that war is not necessary. And in cases like that, of which you could think of many, I mean, the US would never have to go to war with Costa Rica or any of these other places because there's no need to do it when the disparity is so great. So somewhere in that range of near balance but with some differential, that's where you see conflict occurring. The reason there has to be some differential is, in my thesis, my argument, if the two states are almost exactly evenly matched, neither state will tend to believe that they can win. And therefore, the likelihood of conflict is lower because most states, generally, will not enter into a conflict that they do not believe they can win. So that's why I talk about the range of power differential. But the final two commonalities of conflicts are the most important ones. And the next one I'll mention relates to interests. And then finally, I'll talk about exceptionalism, and I'll dwell on that in a little bit more detail. So the issue of interests. We sometimes ask, why do countries go to war? Why do countries get into major international conflicts? Why do non-state actors get into conflicts? And some might say, well, it's because their interests are at stake. But the point that I make about interests is the following. Number one, most countries don't ever fight for interests that they themselves state are very important to them. They don't fight for interests that they say are vital to them. They only fight for two kinds of interests, in my judgment, in my analysis. And one is when the interest is existential, when the very existence of the country or the entity or the regime is in question. In that case, a country will fight, or a non-state actor will fight. But they don't fight for just the normal kinds of so-called national interests. They talk about the interests, but they don't fight over them. So when you hear diplomats in Meade or in the United States State Department or across the world talking about vital interests, notice that what they're doing is talking, not fighting. But when people fight, it's because they feel that an existential interest is challenged. The other interest-related reason that countries fight and non-state actors fight relates to what I call identity interests. And this is something I don't think anyone else has talked about. I think I'm coining the phrase identity interests. And what I mean by that is there are certain interests that are really about a country's very normative and subjective judgment about who it is as a country. And that's not about water, it's not about resources, it's not about minerals, it's not about oil, it's not about how citizens are treated, it's not about human rights. It's about a very normative sense of who they are. And when that is challenged, I would argue, if you look at recent and modern conflicts, but also look at the conflicts and potential conflicts today and going forward, because my theory is intended not to explain all past conflicts, but it is intended to explain future conflicts, you'll see that what countries typically fight for most often is to fight to preserve their sense of identity. And I could give a few examples, but probably the best example of this is the idea of China and Taiwan. In a strict sense, Taiwan is not under the control of the mainland regime. It's not. Theoretically, there is one China. Mainland and Taiwan are part of China. Both sides nominally agree on that, although there are massive disagreements over what that means. But China doesn't control Taiwan today. However, if Taiwan in fact were to go independent, or to seek to go independent, then there is no question in my mind that China would fight a war to stop it. Not because its, quote, objective interests are implicated, but because its sense of identity cannot abide and cannot allow a scenario in which Taiwan goes off on its own. So the interest there is an identity interest. And a lot of countries, when they fight or get into conflict, go into conflict for similar reasons. I will briefly state, I think if we take a close look at Russia and Crimea, that a similar dynamic is at play there. And I'm not offering a judgment about that for purposes of this discussion. But what I am recognizing is that there is a sense of identity deeply rooted in Russian history. And by the way, not just Crimea, but relative to Ukraine itself, that I think is driving a lot of the strategic thinking and the actions that Russia is taking. So, existential interests and identity interests, that's why countries fight. Final point is exceptionalism. The point that I would make, and I'm going to dwell on this in some detail, is that generally speaking, with a few permitted exceptions, that is to say under UN Charter, for example, fighting is a violation of the rules of the world. Generally, you're not supposed to do it except in a case of clear self-defense. But going out and attacking someone is a violation of pretty much every international law, norm, the UN Charter, and so on. So the point that I would make is the exceptionalism factor matters because with countries that regard themselves as exceptional, these are countries that believe that the rules that apply to others don't apply to them. So let me segue to talking a little bit more about exceptionalism. I think a good definition of exceptionalism is the one I just offered. A country is exceptional when it believes that the rules that apply to others do not apply to itself. It can do things that others can't, in its own view. And here, when I use the term exceptional, I'm not talking about what my view is, because what I, David, think doesn't matter. What I'm talking about is the countries themselves think of themselves as exceptional. So we're talking about a self-defined exceptionalism here. And that is a self-defined mindset that the rules that apply to others don't always apply to me. Now, if you look at exceptionalism, I think you can see that there are a number of different kinds of exceptionalism. And I think the type of exceptionalism matters a lot when you want to understand the motivations of the country in question or the non-state entity, and when you want to understand why they're doing what they're doing. So let me say a few words about what I call the three categories of exceptionalism, and I'll give you examples of each one. So the first category of exceptionalism is what I call divine exceptionalism. And divine exceptionalism is the idea that God is on your side, that God is with you, not the other guy. As I put it in a talk that I gave this summer, it's the belief that the breath of God is in your sails. And that is a very special and fundamental kind of exceptionalist mindset that exists in a very small number, a relatively small number of countries and non-state actors in the world. You know the first country I think of when I talk about divine exceptionalism? The United States of America. Rightly or wrongly, we in the United States tend to believe, and I think most Americans do believe, and most American leaders believe and have stated that they believe, that God has blessed our country. Now, I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm saying that's the reality of how the American people feel about our country, that we have been blessed by the Almighty. So we are a divinely exceptional, self-definingly exceptional nation. Another one that comes to mind is ISIS and radical Islam. They believe, perversely, that the brutal acts of terror, violence, and despicable things that they do to fellow human beings are somehow justified by God in their perverse understanding of their presumed relationship with God. So what they do in the name of God as they construe God. So they have this sense of divine exceptionalism as well. And the third country that I would tend to mention in this category, and I'll note that there could be others that could be cited, but here I'm sort of mentioning the primary type of exceptionalism that I think describes the country, is probably Israel. And I think, if anything, Israel is a much less pronounced a case of divine exceptionalism, certainly than the United States, much less, and less than ISIS. But it also has a certain element of, there is a, if you will, biblical narrative about the state of Israel that inherently has a divine component to it. Now, one could also add Iran to that list and a couple of others. But those are examples of divine exceptionals. The second category of exceptionalism is what I call essential or civilizational exceptionalism. And it basically is the idea that there is something about our country that makes us special and, frankly, better than others. And it's rooted in civilization, it's rooted in history, it's rooted in historical achievements, it's rooted in a sense of spirituality. I think you can see where I'm going with this. And I would offer a few countries as examples of this. The first one that would come to mind, frankly, is Russia. I think Russians are very understandably enormously proud of Russian civilization and history and achievements in the arts and sciences and in many other areas. And quite frankly, I think if you scratch the surface, there is a real exceptionalism in this nation that is rooted in Russian civilization, history, and all that's associated with that. China, I would put in this category. By the way, on Russia, I would say the good way to phrase this in a very succinct way is, have you ever heard of the concept of the Russian soul? Right? That's a fundamental mindset in this country, that there is something unique about the Russian soul that is different from, frankly, the American soul. Let's be honest. There's a sense that the Russian soul is deeper than the American soul, that friendships are deeper, that relationships are more meaningful, that the literature is richer, and one could go on in many different ways. I understand it very well. So when you talk about the Russian soul, you're talking about Russian exceptionalism. That's my point. And I'm not judging it. I just think that we have to acknowledge it exists. China, the same thing. The short summary, the Middle Kingdom. When you call yourself the Middle Kingdom, you are an exceptionalist. No question about it. Because you believe you're in the center and everybody else is to the side. But I would also put Japan in this category. One could easily put Iran in this category. And frankly, you could put others. The United States itself, much shorter history, but there is a sense of civilizational strength. Israel and a couple of others. But the main ones, I think, would be Russia, China, Iran, and Japan are good examples. And then there's a third kind of exceptionalism called excluded exceptionalism. And that is the kind of exceptionalism that is, in a sense, a result of being cast out of the community of nations. So when others have said, you are a leper, I don't want to affiliate with you, I am casting you out into the woods, into the desert, away from the community of nations. I am putting you at the children's dinner table, not the adults' dinner table. Then you start to get a sense that you have been excluded. And that generates a sense of exceptionalism that is rooted in excludedness. The folks that I would put in this category are immediately North Korea, which has been cast out of the community of nations, essentially, with all kinds of sanctions and social opprobrium about human rights practices there, and the list goes on, what they've done with their nuclear program. North Korea is not a member of the civilized society of nations. In fact, I don't think it wants to be, in some ways. So that's one. Frankly, I'd put Taiwan in this category. Now, one could say, is Taiwan a state? Is Taiwan not a state? The judgment on that would depend on one's perspective, whether it's coming from a mainland point of view or, frankly, from a Taiwan point of view or other points of view. But the fact is, Taiwan is excluded because it is not, unlike North Korea, it is not even a member of the United Nations. It can't be because, obviously, the People's Republic of China holds the seat. So I would put them in the excluded category. And I would certainly put, certainly you could put ISIS and radical Islam generally in that category. They're obviously well outside the community of nations. And in fact, that's very clear, and they don't even exist as a state, etc. But by the way, you could also put the Palestinian Authority, which is not recognized by all or many as a state, but it is an entity that exists, and it feels as if it is on the outside looking in, and so there's a sense of excludedness there. Now, if you'll have noticed, amongst all the countries that I mentioned, or non-state actors, there are 10. And I want to just crystallize this a little bit to put this list out there, because I didn't do that explicitly in my previous talks. And by the way, for this talk, I added a fair amount of new content relative to some earlier versions that I've done. And I was inspired by the opportunity to come here to do that. So let me just list out what I consider to be the top 10 exceptional states or non-state actors in the world today. And I believe there are basically 10. I'll talk about a couple of others that are on the margins. So in no particular order per se, but I do start with states and end with non-states. The United States, Russia, China, Iran, Israel, Japan, North Korea, and then Taiwan, Palestinian Authority, and radical Islam. And we can say ISIS, we can say Al-Qaeda, we can say Taliban, we can say Boko Haram, and it's all the above. Those are 10. And my argument is that in the world, basically, there exist 10 exceptional states and non-state actors. Those are the 10. No one else is. No one else, I argue, some may disagree, no one else self-regards as exceptional. No one else in the world that matters thinks of itself as not being bound by the rules and norms of the world. So that's my argument, is that those 10, frankly, are where the problems are going to be. Notice that I'm not making a moral judgment. This is not a list of, quote, bad countries. The United States is right at the top of the list, and I don't think the U.S. is a bad country. Some people do. I don't. But this is a list of, quote, good countries, bad countries, depending on perspectives. But it's a mix. Different regime types, different sizes of economies, going from ISIS, which is not a big economic force, and North Korea, which is tiny, to the United States, which is number one, China, number two. These are entities and nations that have different military capacities. And so it's a pretty diverse group. And I say that these are self-definingly exceptional without any sense of moral judgment about that. I think the last point I would make about this, or a couple of additional analytical points before moving on, is that a couple of things. One, if you accept my thesis, which I will fully articulate toward the conclusion, I'll just give you literally the words of my theory. I call it the Firestein theory on major international conflict. And I'll read that in a minute. But if you accept the basic idea of my theory about you have to have a state, you have to have a non-democracy, and so forth, the things I mentioned earlier, then all the problems of the world in terms of potential and current major international conflict are going to involve at least one of these 10 places, which means that about 180 countries of the world, or 185, will never be in a major international conflict. The problems are very concentrated to a small number of places. And again, recognize I've got the U.S. at the top of the list. So I'm looking at this in a what I think is a very objective way. And if you think about within that list, just for example, the United States is allies with 3 other members of the list. Japan, well, 2 members formally, and 1, there's a very strong friendship. Japan is a treaty ally. Israel is a treaty ally. And quite frankly, Taiwan is not an ally, but is a dear friend of America. And so the reality is those 4 will never get into conflict with each other, unquestionably. Similarly, there are others that won't get into conflict with each other, which means when you start narrowing it down, the number of potential conflicts that could exist in the world is a very small number. And you could literally map it out according to this theory. Maybe the theory's right, maybe it's wrong, but according to this theory, it starts to make the world look a little bit less complex than it currently appears to be. It's also worth noting that the limiting number of all the things I talked about, you have to have a state, there are a lot of those. I think there's 193 UN members. You have to have a non-democracy. There are a lot of those in the world. Not as many as there are states, but there are non-democracies. But the limiting number is there are only, in my argument, 10 exceptional nations or non-state entities. That's the number that limits the world and the universe of potential conflict. And the final point that I would make is that only one type of this exceptionalism that I've described is actually malleable or changeable in the short term, and that is excluded exceptionalism. Because if you feel that God is on your side, nothing that anyone in the world generally is ever going to do will ever convince you to change your mind. If you feel that your civilization is superior, nothing that anyone says or does is going to persuade you otherwise. The only exception to that might be absolute, devastating, unconditional military defeat. And that's what happened to Germany in World War II. By the way, with an enormous contribution from the Soviet Union, let's never forget, 26 million dead, the hero cities. Every time I'm in Moscow, I stand in front of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in a quiet moment of respect and prayer and thanks for the contributions of the Soviet Union in the Great Patriotic War. Because without them, there's no way the West could have triumphed over Hitler. So when you think about those things, I think this notion of malleability is very important. You can't change a civilizational sense of greatness, but you can change a sense of excludedness. And by the way, good example right now is Iran. Iran has been a member of the excluded club for a long time, with massive international sanctions, including sanctions supported by Russia, as well as the United States and many others, the world, basically. And now it's starting to change. So a year from now, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, Iran is not going to be a member of the excluded club anymore. And some may like that, some may not like it. There's a big debate in the United States about this. But that's changing. By the way, a nation can also become more excluded. And that's another trend that can happen as well. But let me move to talking about briefly, and I'll try to condense this down, why exceptionalism tends to be associated with conflict. Let me just give you a few reasons in quick order. Number one, if you think that the rules don't apply to me, then the rules prohibiting conflict or warfare don't apply to you. So you have a free pass in your own mind about what you can do. And let's be honest, no one has utilized this free pass more than the United States. Let's be very clear about that. Over many years, the United States has gone into this country, into that country, into the other country, for reasons that the United States has believed have been absolutely justified, but there's no question that the United States has felt that it has a special authority to do that. So I'm not judging it, I'm simply saying that that's a reality and we have to recognize it, and other countries are like that too. If you don't think the rules apply, you're going to get into conflict more often. Secondly, exceptional countries tend to have a kind of righteousness about them. They tend to think they're right and everyone else is wrong. Third, if you're exceptional, you probably have a distorted lens through which you're seeing your own national security interests. Because if you think that God is on your side and someone does something to cross you, then they're crossing God. And that's a big deal. All of a sudden, you're looking at your interests a different way than a country would be looking at them if they don't think that God is on their side. So your lens changes and your calculations change. Relatedly, if you're an exceptional nation or non-state actor, it distorts your perception of world opinion, perhaps, so that you may think you have more support for doing what you do than you actually do. In the case of divine exceptionalism, you think that God is on your side, you have a sense of destiny, and you think we can't lose. In the case of excluded exceptionalism, you think about it differently. You say, what do we have to lose? Who cares? If we're already excluded, we're already sanctioned, we're already on the edge of civilization, we're already at the children's table, not the adults' table, then who cares? What difference does it make? We can do anything we want. In a negative sense, it's a very liberating mindset. So, and I would also note that in cases in which there is not a high level of direct electoral accountability, those countries or non-state entities, and by the way, I think no non-state entity is a democracy of the ones that we see acting today, although arguably Palestinian Authority could be characterized that way. One could discuss that, but certainly ISIS is not, and so on. And radical Islam more generally. And in a case like that, there's two problems. In democracies, you actually have a rules-based system, and you respect rules, generally. But if you're not a rules-based system, then that's one less constraint. And secondly, if you don't have to answer to an electorate, that's a further less constraint relative to going into war. The reason is moms and dads and grandma and grandpa don't like to send their young people into wars. And when they have a vote, and when there's direct electoral accountability, national leaders tend to be very reluctant to casually send people into war. That's why I say that the greatest force for peace in the world is a voting public. So that's another factor for democracy. Let me just briefly say before concluding, if you look at where the major conflicts are today, I think my theory matches up well with the conflicts and the potential conflicts. In other words, I don't see any contradictions right now between what I'm offering as a theory and the reality of the world as we see it. If I did, then I'd need to change the theory and I probably wouldn't be giving this lecture right now. But let me just give a few examples. And I'll start in the order of highest level of stability, which is to say the lowest likelihood of going to war, to increasingly higher levels of instability and greater likelihoods of going to war. So the first point that I would make is China. potential conflicts with Japan, potential conflicts with Taiwan, frankly, potential conflicts with Vietnam, Philippines, and others around the South China Sea. All the attributes that I've described are there, but the likelihood of it actually escalating into war is low. And by the way, I neglected to mention one important caveat, and that is what I call the nuclear caveat. If you have all the other factors, but if you have two nuclear-armed powers, and the weaker power can deliver a nuclear strike upon the greater power, you will not have a conflict because of the principle of nuclear deterrence. So, for various reasons, I see the potential for conflict, but I don't see a high likelihood of conflagration in the immediate sense. The next one I would say, in terms of major conflict, going up the scale, but again fairly stable, is Russia and Ukraine. There is conflict. There has been loss of life. There are ongoing tensions. There are profound disagreements between Russia on the one hand and most of the rest of the world on the other as to what is happening. Without going into that, I think it's also fair to say that Russia is rivaled only by the United States in terms of its nuclear arsenal. And the likelihood that Russia will ever get into a major international conflict beyond its immediate periphery, I think, is extremely low. Then you go to North Korea. North Korea is another case in which you've got, again, an exceptional nation, a lot of different scenarios that could play out. There's refugee crises, there's a nuclear scenario, there's accidental war with the South, and so on. That's a fairly volatile situation, and that moves up the ladder. Then you've got Iran. That's under deep into obviously negotiations for a long time, and now an agreement that has been reached and that has been ratified by a number of the players, and I think not yet by the United States. It will likely be ratified or accepted by the United States Congress. And with that agreement, I think that it decreases the likelihood of conflict, but it's still there. But the conflict that I worry about is not Iran-United States. The conflict I worry about is Iran-Israel. And there's still a real possibility that could occur. And I think Iran-Israel is the likeliest potential state-to-state conflict in the world today. State-to-state. I'm not saying it is likely, but I'm saying it is more likely than all the others. And then finally, there's radical Islam. And that is a very volatile situation. Russia, the United States, and many others, most others in the world, agree that this is a scourge that needs to be dealt with and eliminated. But at the same time, that's going to last for quite some time. Let me conclude by saying briefly, there are a lot of implications for policymakers. For one thing, I think this is a different lens for looking at conflict in the world. Secondly, it is a way of thinking about where likely scenarios or where certain conflict scenarios are more likely and certain are less. And that helps in judgments about the allocation of increasingly scarce defense resources, which I think is important. You can't always do everything the way you'd like to, so you have to make compromises within your own national security system to say this is what we think is the likelier threat. And if this theory is real, then it's a tool that policymakers can use as they make those judgments about resource allocation. Let me just conclude with laying out my theory per se. And I have never done this before. This is the first time. I'm going to actually read what I would presumptuously call the Firestein theory of major international conflict. And it's specifically this. Major international conflict will tend to occur between two or more parties when all of the following conditions are met. Number one, at least one of the two or more parties is a state. Number two, at least one is a non-democracy. Number three, at least one is a non-nuclear power. Number four, at least one self-regards as exceptional. And as I said earlier, that's the controlling number because that's the smallest number of states and non-states, which I put at about 10. And number five, where at least one of the parties perceives the implication of a national or regime interest that is either existential or relating to that party's core sense of identity. Period. That's my theory. Now, just briefly, this theory, therefore, posits that major international conflicts will not occur, let me repeat, will not occur between non-state actors, between democracies, between nuclear weapon states, between countries neither of which regard themselves as exceptional, and that they will also not occur among states who are grappling with interests below the existential or identity level of importance. So that's the basic idea. And I think the main takeaway point is the idea that there are actually, according to this theory, which I think so far holds up, but again, I'd love to hear any comments, challenges, counterexamples in just a moment. According to this theory, the number of potential, real, major international conflicts, not civil war, etc., is actually very limited. And it's going to involve at least one of those 10 entities and states that I talked about. So I hope that this, I went a couple of minutes over, but I hope that this idea resonates with you. I hope you have thoughts about it. I hope that it perhaps lends a little bit more structure and perhaps a good analytical framework to test against the real world. And with that, I want to thank you again. And Professor, thank you so much. Once again, Vladimir, thank you for your introduction. I'm grateful for your time, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much. Yes, sir, here first, and then we'll go down here, then to you and over. So, yes.
Firestein, thank you for...
Oh, yeah, please come up to the microphone so that it can be, the audio can be recorded.
Mr. Firestein, thank you for visiting our university. It's a great honor to see you here. My name is Rav Gabazov. I'm the student of the third MIU faculty. And well, first of all, I want to challenge you, but first I want to comment on your lecture, why I liked it. Well, you've mentioned a few scholars like Huntington, if I'm not mistaken, and you've said that you disagree with his term Islamic civilization as there are Sunnis and Shias. Well, you're absolutely right. There are right-wing Shias and there are Ibadis who believe that, for example, the real Quran is the Codex of Ali, not Codex of Usman, and it's hidden. So the most Muslims follow the fake Quran. The real Quran is hidden somewhere, and the chosen ancestor is going to bring it. Like the Calafians, for example. It's an instinct branch of Islam. Well, they didn't call themselves Muslims because it's an Arabic name. They believe that every nation should call itself in its own language. Because literally, the word Muslim means the one who submits to God. The word Christian means the follower of Messiah. They called themselves both. So they were sort of their own religion, I think. The religion of Adam. So they follow the gospel, and at the same time, they believe the real Quran is hidden somewhere. So that's why I really agree with you, because their teaching is extremely interesting, and they follow the gospel literally. So they're neither Islamic civilization nor Christian, something unique, like I call it the Nazarene Civilization. There is a very interesting sign. It's called Nazar. It's a Shia sign, and that's how Jesus was called in the first versions of the Bible, not Christ, but Nazarene, and how the first followers of Jesus called themselves. So they were completely different. Their church allowed the institution of concubines, and well, like the same as Shias do. So that's why I liked your lecture. But now, why I want to challenge you. You had a top 10 list with the US as the main guy, I think, the big guy. My personal opinion that the big guy is neither US nor Russia. Is the European Union. And you didn't mention it. But let's look at the European Union. It's become a new superpower. Well, many people say like, the French are never going to cooperate with Germans or British. Let's face it, the Germans unite their Krauss-Maffei-Wegmann with an extra company. And now they're building new vehicles. And if we look at their technological level, I'll have to say they're superior both to Russia and the US. If you look at Leopard tanks, howitzers from Sweden, and Tiger helicopters, and so on and so forth, they are superior. So my personal opinion that the new superpower is the European Union.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the points and for challenging me. I really appreciate that. That's one of the things I enjoyed about teaching here. But let me also be the diplomat, as I was for 18 years, and say that you and I don't disagree, but we're not talking about the same thing. My top 10 list was not superpowers. My top 10 was the top 10 exceptional states or non-states in the world. And I regard EU as a very rules-based system in which they are a model member of the international community. You're absolutely right about technology, about the fact that it is a major power in the world. I agree with you about that. I agree with your analysis. But the point that I was making is not a top 10 superpowers, but top 10 exceptionals. And I would not characterize EU as an exceptional. I would characterize them as an important power, but one that generally plays within the rules. That's why I don't list them as being exceptional.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you. Yes, sir, and then we'll go to you. Yeah.
Well, I represent older generation because I'm director of analytical center here. And by the way, some practical issues we will have the opportunity to discuss later because I'm the member of Russian delegation on drugs, by the way, yeah. But since we will be very busy with these practical issues later, now I want to ask you one theoretical question because this is of high interest for me. Because actually I would agree with all your factors, but I want to ask you about your perception of one more factor. Which is the deficit of information and miscalculation that can be a result of this. And I will give you one example which is both of theoretical and of practical interest for us. This is Russia and United States. If you ask any ordinary person in Russia about today's policy of United States, you will probably recognize that this person doesn't know much. There are some myths, some misperceptions, etc. If you ask people who should be well informed in Russia about the policy of United States, you will probably find something that, well, they are not so well informed. Sometimes, not generally, of course. But if you go to United States and ask something about Russia, you will recognize that ordinary Americans, of course, do not know anything about Russia, and this is tradition. Americans do not want to know anything about outside world at all. This is their exceptionalism, okay? But what about American political elite? And American academical elite, most of all? We know that during the Cold War, we had a tradition of Russian studies, of Kremlinology, of Sovietology, etc. But then all this tradition was absolutely disbanded, and most importantly, that universities started to consider these issues as of secondary importance. Government centers like think tanks, etc., stopped to finance it. Even the guys who knew Russian from CIA were fired in order to take people who know Chinese, Arabic, etc. So now, even now, when we have this talk about new Cold War, we have the same situation, yeah? No finances for these studies, no real knowledge of the situation. And of course, we have many people who know Russia by their previous experience, yes. But as for new generation, we have a gap in knowledge. And so my question is about this. Can this be a major factor in potential conflict?
It's a really good question. And I broadly agree with the premises of your question. I think there is insufficient knowledge on both sides to some degree about certainly policy matters. Quite frankly, it's not helped by the fact that the media environments, for different reasons, sometimes garble and muddy the messaging. You're consumers of Russian news. I'm not a daily consumer of Russian news. I will let you judge the quality of the news that you're getting here about U.S. policy. By the same token, for different reasons in the United States, I think there tends to be a tendency to seek conflict and seek problems because that's what news is in the U.S. mindset. And so it may generate a somewhat more negative light or backdrop to a lot of the issues. So the media is important, education is important. I will say my personal view is I think both countries have to do as much as they can to open up channels of communication, to have exchanges of professors, exchanges of students, exchanges of tourists. We should open up the visa regimes of both countries. I'd love to see many more Americans coming to Russia. I'd love to see many more Russians traveling to the US, and there are pretty good numbers already. I will say, when I learned, frankly, of the decision made by Russian authorities to close down the American Center of Moscow over in the Library of Foreign Languages, I thought that was an unfortunate decision that sends the wrong signal, because it cuts off one valuable opportunity for Americans and Russians to interact and to understand each other better. That just happened in the last couple of weeks. And that's the kind of thing that neither the United States nor Russia, in my personal opinion, should be doing. So I think the issues that you cite are legitimate. I think there is a deficit of understanding. If I were to take 20 seconds to give people here a sense for what I think the average American understands about Russia, I would give you a few phrases, and I'm just telling you what I think people understand. I'm not endorsing or not endorsing. I think people think Russia's big. I think people think Russia's powerful. People think Russia has a lot of nuclear weapons. This is what average people understand. People know that there's a guy named Mr. Putin who's the leader of Russia. They probably don't know the names of foreign ministers or other high officials and other folks. Sometimes we know the names of other Russian stars or athletes, but generally, politically, probably almost every American knows the name Vladimir Putin. I think most Americans know that Russia is somehow doing something in Ukraine. That's what they think. They don't necessarily couldn't explain the details of what happened yesterday or what happened 6 weeks ago. But I think most Americans also think that Russia is a great culture, that it has made enormous contributions to literature and the arts and ballet. It's technologically highly advanced. But I think there's a level of concern about an increasing sense of competition with Russia that Americans perceive based on some acts that have occurred in the world, some actions that Russia has taken in the world in recent years. I'm not sure that that is an inaccurate assessment, but I would agree that I don't think that American understanding of Russia generally is much more detailed than what I've described. Now, you can judge, is that accurate, is that inaccurate? I think it's probably fairly accurate at a very, very broad level, but very imperfect when you try to get into details. And I think that's regrettable. And that's the kind of thing that Vladimir and I at the East-West Institute want to try to address, working with our very good friends here in Russia and the United States. Thank you. Yes, sir. And I'll try to be as brief as I can. If you're brief, I'll be brief, and we'll get as many questions as we can before we have to go in about 5 minutes. Yes, sir.
First of all, thank you, Professor, for giving the speech. My name is Johnson. I'm from China, and I have actually 2 questions. I'll try to make it brief. So the first question, they are somehow all related to East Asia. The first question is about China. So it's the first time I ever heard about the notion exceptionalism, and it's very enlightening. Before, that reminds me of the notion given by our president called Chinese dream. And beforehand, we always, like in China, we always compare this notion with the American dream. So it's like more used domestically. But now, in light of your speech, I would say, can you kind of comment on the, so like regarding China's recent movement, for example, the One Belt, One Road strategy is economic development in Central Asia. Do you think that China exerts its international influence under the umbrella of Chinese dream, or it's like try to create some kind of a Chinese attraction? Well, certainly it's not selling the supremism of communism anymore, but it's trying to sell something of a Chinese identity. That's my first question. And then the second question is more about the definition of exceptionalism. So you talk about the relation between exceptionalism and international conflict, but I think that's part of a constructivism idea. And for me, I put myself more in a realist camp. And for me, I think that this theory might have a problem on explaining the international cooperation instead of international conflict. For example, I believe what you believe is that conflict never exists between democratic countries. However, right now we see closer and closer cooperation between countries such as China and South Korea, which has nothing, ideologically nothing coexist. But also, like, South Korea doesn't believe that China is a exceptional country because of their nationalism, and vice versa. So how do you explain international cooperation based on exceptionalism? Those are my two questions. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot. Great, terrific questions. And let me just say a couple things. One, on the Chinese dream, I think you do hit on something important, which is I think there is a kind of implicit nexus or connection between the notion of the Chinese dream, which is an important idea now in China, with the rise of Xi Jinping as China's leader some years ago. And I think there is a bit of an exceptionalist flavor to the China dream. It's not spoken about in explicit terms, but it is the idea that we were once a great nation and we should be a great nation again. And in an implicit way, it is calling upon that pride that Chinese rightfully feel about their civilization and their history, long history, and saying, let us be a nation that can make us all proud again. That there was a century where we were humiliated, occupied, etc. No more. Obviously, that ended in 1949. China has developed in a way that's unimaginable in the decades since. And now there's a sense that China has a shot at becoming the nation among nations that it was many generations ago, frankly, thousands of years ago. There is an exceptional quality, I think, to that discussion. So I think you're right to posit that there is, the notion that there is a relationship. On the last point, let me just be brief, because it's a great question. I wish I could spend 10 minutes answering it, but let me make maybe one basic point. What I've offered is a theory of conflict. And it's a theory of conflict that says, as many others have said before for a long time, democracies don't fight each other. But I've gone further and added a number of other points, and I've also added exceptionalism and so on. But it also doesn't mean that democracies and autocracies, or countries that do have electoral accountability, countries that don't have electoral accountability, necessarily have to fight. It's a necessary but not sufficient condition of conflict, but there have to be other things. So with China and Korea, you don't have necessarily either side feeling, for example, that an existential or identity interest is implicated. Therefore, there's no inherent reason conflict would exist, notwithstanding the differences in ideologies. So what I'm saying is you have to have a mix of 5 different things, not just one, and I think that jives with what you're saying. But the other thing I would say is, you mentioned constructivist. The point that I would make to this group, as folks that are studying international relations, is the idea, and many other subjects, but sort of in a place that focuses on these issues. National interests are human constructions. They are not inherent. They don't exist in the scientific world. They're not on the elemental chart. They are things that somebody dreams up when they are about to go to sleep at night and pushes through their parliament, pushes through their national security bureaucracy, but they are not inherent. They're constructions. And so they're very subjective. And when you use the term constructivism, it prompted me to make the point that there is a high level of subjectivity to the understanding and construction of national interests. I don't think we realize that enough. But I would offer a case that hits close to home, and 2 cases in terms of China, Taiwan. And in terms of Russia, the issue of Crimea and the issue of Ukraine. These are things that are they reflect very normative and subjective assessments by the leadership of these nations as to the importance of something that can't necessarily be quantified in dollar terms. And so I just want to make this broad point. Interests are constructions, they're subjective, they can change, they're not scientific, they're not material. And I could give you examples where countries have not acted upon what would presumably be very clear-cut, near existential interests. But they've simply opted and chosen not to do it, which shows that this is a very subjective process. But there's more I could say, but I'll stop there. Thanks, Johnson, I appreciate it. Do we have time for one more? Are we done? Last one. Yeah, yes, sir.
Very short.
Yeah, and I'll be short, and if you could be short, I'll try to match you.
Hi, I'm James Oates. I'm an international relations master's student. My question is, how tightly do you define like major conflict? Because my concern is that your theory, it can explain a very, very small amount of things, but my worry is that there are lots of potential sort of asymmetrical warfare, the kind of India-Pakistan stuff where they don't actually engage in proper war. So I'd just like to hear a bit more about how you sort of deal with that.
It's a terrific question, and it's something. The short answer is, on my immediate to-do list is to have a very rigorous, methodical answer to that question. I don't yet. I would offer that. I'll use an American expression. Right now, my approach to it is similar to the American Supreme Court's or others' approach to pornography. It's hard to define, but you know it when you see it. And I think major international conflict is hard to define in an immediate sense, but you know it when you see it. What I would say is what I plan to do, and I've had this on my list for a while, is to try to look at how to quantify that. Is it number of troops involved? Is it number of casualties or deaths? Is it the amount of resources that are put into a war effort? Is it the amount of press attention that it's getting? Is it number of UN Security Council resolutions regarding the matter or attempts at resolutions? So there are metrics one can use, and I don't have it specifically in mind right now, but I would say there are clear-cut cases there in both directions where this is major international conflict. Like a full-on war, like World War II, like World War I, like the Vietnam War, or many other examples we could cite. There are also gray areas. To be very honest, I think the whole issue of Russia-Ukraine is a bit of a gray area as to what one would classify it as being. There are even fundamental disagreements as to whether there is, quote, a conflict or not, and I understand that. But that one is not maybe clear-cut from a definitional standpoint. This is an area that I need to look at, but I think it's going to involve trying to be specific and making subjective judgments about some of those metrics so that whether one agrees or disagrees with my methodology, at least my methodology is transparent. So I need to do more work on that, and you're absolutely right to touch on that. Thank you all. Really appreciate it. Professor, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And by the way, I'll stick around for a little bit. If anyone has questions, I'll stand outside, and I'd be happy to talk to you. I really enjoyed it.